The candlelight flickered across his face as he raised his wine glass, and for one terrifying moment, I remembered everything. Not the fragments and shadows that had been haunting me for months, but the crystal clear memory of why I had packed my bags and walked out of our life together 3 years ago. My name is Sarah Chen. I'm 31 years old, and until that anniversary dinner, I thought the car accident had stolen my memories forever. I was wrong. It had been protecting me from them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The doctors at Cedar Valley Medical Center had been optimistic about my recovery, given the circumstances. When the delivery truck ran the red light and slammed into the passenger side of my Honda Civic that rainy October evening, they said it was a miracle I survived it all. 3 weeks in a coma, 2 months of physical therapy, and what they delicately termed selective retrograde amnesia, affecting roughly 4 years of my life. The irony wasn't lost on me that the accident had happened on October 15th, exactly 3 years to the day after I had left Marcus. I woke up in that sterile hospital room believing I was 27 years old, and happily engaged to the man I'd been with since college. The last clear memory I could access was Marcus surprising me with a weekend trip to Napa Valley for my birthday, where we'd stayed at that charming bed and breakfast with the wraparound porch and the owner's golden retriever who followed us everywhere. In my confused, medication-hazed mind, that trip had happened just weeks ago. The reality that it had occurred over 4 years earlier, and that our relationship had ended badly, was completely erased from my consciousness. Marcus had been there when I woke up, holding my hand and crying tears that I assumed were relief. His dark hair was longer than I remembered, and there were lines around his green eyes that seemed deeper, but I attributed that to the stress of my accident. When he explained that we were married now, that the wedding had taken place 2 years ago in a small ceremony because I'd wanted something intimate, I felt a strange disconnect, but assumed it was the head injury affecting my ability to process emotions properly. The neurologist, Dr. Patricia Valdez, had explained that memory loss after traumatic brain injury was unpredictable. Some patients recovered everything within days, others took months or years, and some memories never returned at all. The key, she emphasized, was not to force anything, not to push too hard to remember, as it could actually interfere with the natural healing process. Marcus had nodded solemnly at this advice, squeezing my hand reassuringly. What I didn't know then was that Marcus had specifically requested that certain people not be allowed to visit me during my recovery. My sister Jessica, who lived in Portland, had been told by hospital staff that I was too fragile for visitors outside immediate family. My best friend Rachel from work had been informed that I needed complete rest, and that too much stimulation could set back my progress. My colleagues at the marketing firm where I'd been an account director were told I wouldn't be returning, and that Marcus would handle any personal items from my office. The apartment Marcus brought me home to was beautiful, a modern 2-bedroom unit in the trendy Harbor District with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay. He told me we'd moved there after our wedding, that I'd loved the natural light from my photography hobby. The space was decorated with a sophisticated color palette of grays and blues, minimalist furniture, and carefully curated art pieces. It should have felt like home, but instead it felt like staying in an expensive hotel. During those first weeks of recovery, I spent hours studying the photo albums Marcus had compiled of our life together. There were pictures of our engagement party, which I remembered vaguely, and then a gap before photos of what he said was our wedding. This ceremony looked small and elegant, held in the garden of a historic mansion downtown. I was wearing a simple cream-colored dress I didn't remember choosing, and my hair was styled in an elaborate updo that seemed unlike my usual preferences. In every photo, I was smiling, but there was something about my expression that bothered me, though I couldn't pinpoint what. The wedding photos were followed by images of what Marcus described as our honeymoon in Costa Rica. There I was, zip-lining through the rainforest, snorkeling in crystal-clear waters and sharing romantic dinners on the beach. I looked happy in these pictures, tanned and relaxed, but again there was that nagging feeling that something was off. The woman in these photos looked like me, but she seemed like a stranger performing the role of a blissful newlywed. Marcus was incredibly attentive during my recovery, taking time off from his job as a financial advisor to care for me. He prepared elaborate meals, ran warm baths with lavender oil, and read to me in the evenings when headaches made it difficult for me to focus on books myself. He was patient when I struggled to remember how to use the coffee machine, or couldn't recall the plot of a movie we'd supposedly watched together dozens of times. He never seemed frustrated by my condition, only concerned and loving. The physical therapy sessions were exhausting but necessary. The accident had left me with some weakness on my left side and occasional balance issues. 3 times a week, Marcus would drive me to the rehabilitation center, wait patiently during my sessions, and encourage me when I felt discouraged by my slow progress. The therapists there were wonderful, particularly Maria Santos, a woman about my mother's age, who had a gift for motivating patients through the most challenging exercises. During one session, about 6 weeks after I'd been released from the hospital, Maria was helping me work on fine motor skills, when she mentioned something that struck me as odd. She said that my improvement was remarkable, that most patients with my type of injury showed much more pronounced deficits in their coordination. When I mentioned this to Marcus later, he quickly changed the subject, suggesting we focus on looking forward rather than dwelling on medical details. It was around this time that I started having what I can only describe as emotional flashbacks. Not visual memories, but sudden, overwhelming feelings that seemed to come from nowhere. I'd be folding laundry or washing dishes, and suddenly I'd feel anxious or angry or sad without any apparent cause. When I tried to explore these feelings to understand where they were coming from, my mind would hit a wall, like trying to remember a dream that dissolves the moment you wake up. Marcus suggested that these episodes were probably related to my brain injury, that emotional regulation was often affected by trauma. He encouraged me to talk to Dr. Valdez about medication that might help stabilize my moods. I agreed to consider it, but something inside me resisted the idea of medicating away feelings that, inexplicable as they were, felt important somehow. The apartment itself began to feel increasingly strange to me as the weeks passed. Marcus said I'd chosen most of the furniture and decorations, but nothing felt familiar or personal. There were no books that seemed like ones I would have selected, no music that resonated with me, no personal mementos that sparked any recognition. When I asked about my things from our previous place, Marcus explained that we'd downsized significantly when we moved, donating most of our old furniture and belongings to make room for our new aesthetic. He showed me a storage unit across town where he said we kept seasonal items and things we didn't have space for in the apartment. The unit was organized with military precision, containing holiday decorations, winter clothes, and boxes labeled with neat handwriting that Marcus said was mine. When I opened one box labeled Sarah's College Memories, I found yearbooks, photo albums, and papers that were definitely mine, but they felt like artifacts from someone else's life. The strangest thing was that none of my photography equipment was in storage. Marcus explained that I'd sold most of it before the accident because I'd lost interest in the hobby. This puzzled me because even with my limited memories, I could recall how passionate I'd been about photography in college, how I'd saved for months to buy my first professional camera, how I'd spent entire weekends wandering the city looking for the perfect shot. Work was another source of confusion. Marcus said I'd been between jobs when the accident happened, that I'd left my position at the marketing firm because I was unhappy there and wanted to try freelancing. This seemed plausible enough, but when I suggested reaching out to former colleagues to let them know I was okay, Marcus gently discouraged me, saying it would be better to focus on my health rather than potentially stressful reminders of a job I'd been eager to leave behind. The isolation, though Marcus never called it that, began to wear on me. He was wonderful company, but I missed having friends to talk to, missed the casual interactions with coworkers, missed feeling connected to a broader community. When I mentioned this, Marcus reminded me that I'd never been particularly social, that I'd always preferred quiet evenings at home to parties or large gatherings. This seemed inconsistent with some of my college memories, where I recalled being quite outgoing, but I assumed my personality had changed as I'd gotten older. About 3 months into my recovery, I had my first major breakthrough in terms of physical coordination. I was able to complete a complex puzzle that had been frustrating me for weeks, and I felt genuinely proud of the accomplishment. That evening, to celebrate, Marcus suggested we go out to dinner at a restaurant he said was one of our favorites, a small Italian place called Benedetto's in the historic district. The restaurant was charming, with exposed brick walls, vintage photographs of Italy, and tables lit by candles in wine bottles. The owner, an elderly man named Giuseppe, greeted Marcus warmly and made a fuss over me, saying how good it was to see me looking so much better. He mentioned that he'd been worried when Marcus had told him about my accident, and that he'd missed seeing us for our regular Thursday dinners. This confused me because Marcus had never mentioned that we were regular customers anywhere, and Thursday seemed like an odd night for a recurring dinner date. When I asked Marcus about it later, he said Giuseppe was probably thinking of someone else, that we'd only been to the restaurant a few times and always on weekends. But Giuseppe had seemed so certain, and his concern for my well-being had felt genuine and personal. The food at Benedetto's was delicious, and I found myself relaxing in the warm atmosphere. It was the first time since the accident that I'd felt truly comfortable in a social setting outside our apartment. Giuseppe brought us complimentary dessert and told stories about his family in Sicily, and for a few hours I felt like a normal person rather than a patient recovering from trauma. On the drive home, Marcus seemed quieter than usual. When I commented on how nice the evening had been, how good it felt to be out in the world again, he agreed but suggested that too much stimulation might not be good for my recovery. He reminded me that Dr. Valdez had emphasized the importance of not overwhelming my healing brain with too many new experiences at once. That night, I had the first dream I could remember since the accident. It wasn't about the crash itself, but about a conversation in what looked like our old apartment, a place I couldn't quite visualize but that felt familiar. In the dream, I was packing a suitcase while Marcus stood in the doorway pleading with me to stay. I was crying but determined, saying something about trust and lies, though I couldn't make out the specific words. I woke up with my heart pounding and a strange taste in my mouth, like I'd been crying in my sleep.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
When I told Marcus about the dream, he held me close and said it was probably just my brain processing the trauma of the accident, creating fictional scenarios based on the fear of loss. He reminded me that dreams after brain injury were often vivid and confusing, that I shouldn't read too much into them. But the dream had felt different from the weird, nonsensical dreams that had occasionally punctuated my sleep during recovery. It had felt like a memory trying to surface. Around this time, I began to notice small inconsistencies in the stories Marcus told about our life together. He said I'd never liked spicy food, but I found myself craving Thai and Indian dishes. He insisted I'd always been a morning person, but I felt most energetic and creative in the evening hours. He claimed I'd never been interested in hiking, but when we passed a trailhead during a drive through the mountains, I felt a strong pull to explore the paths winding up into the forest. The most unsettling discrepancy involved my relationship with my family. Marcus said I'd become estranged from my parents after they disapproved of our relationship, that the stress of their criticism had led me to minimize contact with them. This seemed completely out of character for me, as I remembered being very close to both my mother and father, talking to them regularly and visiting whenever possible. When I suggested calling them to let them know about my recovery, Marcus said he'd already been in touch with them, that they knew about the accident but felt it would be better not to complicate my healing process with family drama. The explanation felt reasonable on the surface, but something about it nagged at me. My parents had always been supportive people, and while they might have had concerns about a relationship, I couldn't imagine them abandoning me during a medical crisis. I began to wonder if my memory loss was more extensive than I'd realized, if perhaps my relationship with my family had deteriorated in ways I simply couldn't access. Physical therapy continued to go well, and Dr. Valdez was pleased with my progress during monthly checkups. My balance had improved significantly, and the headaches that had plagued me in the early weeks of recovery were becoming less frequent and less severe. She said that from a neurological standpoint, I was healing remarkably well, though she cautioned that memory recovery could still be unpredictable and might continue for months or even years. During one appointment, Dr. Valdez asked about my emotional state, whether I was experiencing depression or anxiety that might interfere with my overall recovery. I mentioned the strange moments of unexplained sadness or anger, and she nodded knowingly, saying that emotional regulation issues were common after brain trauma. However, she seemed surprised when I told her I wasn't taking any medication for mood stabilization, as she said she'd recommended it during our previous meetings. When I mentioned this to Marcus, he said there had been some confusion with the prescription, that Dr. Valdez had initially suggested medication, but then decided it wasn't necessary given my good progress. The explanation seemed plausible, but I was beginning to notice a pattern where Marcus had explanations for every inconsistency, every moment of confusion, every question that arose about our life together. I started keeping a journal, partly as a memory exercise recommended by my therapists, and partly because I was feeling the need to process my thoughts and feelings somewhere private. Writing felt natural and therapeutic, and I discovered that my handwriting, while somewhat shaky at first, quickly returned to its familiar flowing script. The act of putting words on paper seemed to unlock something in my brain, a connection between thought and expression that felt both rustic and profound. In my journal, I began documenting not just my daily activities and progress, but also the strange feelings and fragments of images that sometimes flickered through my consciousness. There was a recurring sensation of standing in bright sunlight, laughing with someone whose face I couldn't see clearly. There was the memory of a cat with orange fur, though Marcus said we'd never had pets because I was allergic. There was the taste of homemade chocolate chip cookies that made me feel safe and loved, though Marcus insisted I'd never been much of a baker. These fragments didn't form coherent memories, but they felt important, like pieces of a puzzle that would eventually reveal a larger picture. I didn't share most of these details with Marcus because his responses to my memory questions had become somewhat predictable. He would listen patiently, then gently suggest that brain injuries could create false memories, that I shouldn't trust these fleeting impressions more than the documented evidence of our life together. The apartment that had never quite felt like home began to feel increasingly claustrophobic. I found myself standing at the large windows, staring out at the bay and the city beyond, feeling an almost physical yearning to be out in the world. When I mentioned to Marcus that I thought I was ready to start looking for work, perhaps something part-time to ease back into a normal routine, he expressed concern about rushing my recovery. He pointed out that we were financially comfortable, that his income was more than sufficient to support us both, and that there was no pressure for me to return to work until I was completely healed. While this was generous and caring, something about being completely dependent on him made me uncomfortable. I'd always been independent, even in my fragmented memories of college and early adulthood, and the idea of indefinite unemployment felt wrong. Marcus suggested that instead of jumping back into a demanding work environment, I might consider exploring creative hobbies that could be therapeutic, as well as fulfilling. He bought me art supplies and encouraged me to try painting, saying that the fine motor control required would be good practice for my recovering coordination. The gesture was thoughtful, but when I sat down with the brushes and canvas, nothing felt right. The colors seemed wrong, the medium felt foreign, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was meant to be creating something entirely different. One afternoon while Marcus was at work, I decided to walk to the nearby shopping district rather than taking the bus as I usually did. The exercise felt good, and I enjoyed the rhythm of walking, the gradual recognition of landmarks, the small interactions with shopkeepers and other pedestrians. I found myself drawn to a camera store, pressing my face to the window to admire the equipment displayed there. An older man came out of the store, apparently noticing my interest, and struck up a conversation about photography. He mentioned that I looked familiar, that he thought I might have been a customer before my accident. He said he remembered someone matching my description, who'd been saving up for a particular lens, that she'd been passionate about landscape photography, and had shown him some beautiful shots of the coastline north of the city. This conversation excited me more than anything had since my recovery began. Here was someone who seemed to remember me, who could confirm that I'd been serious about photography, who had specific details about my interests and goals. When I got home and told Marcus about the encounter, however, he suggested that the man was probably confusing me with someone else, that photography equipment stores saw many customers, and it would be easy to mix people up. But the conversation had awakened something in me, a certainty that photography had been important to me, that it represented more than just a casual hobby. I began to push Marcus more directly about what had happened to my cameras and equipment, why there was no evidence in our apartment or storage unit of what had apparently been a significant interest. His explanation was more detailed this time. He said that about 6 months before my accident, I'd become frustrated with my lack of progress as a photographer, that I'd decided I wasn't talented enough to make it more than a hobby, and had sold everything in a moment of disappointment. He'd tried to talk me out of it, he said, but I'd been determined to use the money for something more practical. The story felt wrong to me, inconsistent with the person I remembered being, someone who didn't give up easily on things that mattered to her. But Marcus seemed so certain, so concerned about my well-being, that I began to wonder if my injury had affected my personality more than I realized. If perhaps the person I remembered being was different from who I'd actually become in the years I couldn't recall. It was during this period of questioning and confusion that Marcus surprised me with plans for a romantic getaway to celebrate our second wedding anniversary. He'd booked us a weekend at a luxury resort in the mountains, a place he said we'd talked about visiting but had never had the chance to experience together. The gesture was thoughtful and romantic, and I found myself looking forward to getting away from the city, from the apartment that still felt foreign, from the routine of recovery that had begun to feel stagnant. The resort was beautiful, nestled in a valley surrounded by pine forests and offering stunning views of distant peaks. Our room was elegant and comfortable, with a private balcony and a fireplace that Marcus kept burning throughout our stay. He'd arranged for spa treatments, romantic dinners, and scenic drives through the mountain roads. It should have been perfect, and in many ways it was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching someone else live this romantic weekend, that I was an actor playing a role in someone else's love story. On our anniversary night, Marcus had arranged for a private dinner on the resort's terrace, complete with champagne and a string quartet playing softly in the background. The setting was magical, with twinkling lights strung overhead and the mountains silhouetted against a star-filled sky. Marcus gave me a beautiful pearl necklace, saying it reminded him of the one I'd worn on our wedding day, though I had no memory of any wedding jewelry. As the evening progressed and the champagne flowed, I found myself relaxing more than I had in months. The mountain air was crisp and clean, the music was soothing, and Marcus was at his most charming, telling stories and making me laugh in ways that felt natural and comfortable. For the first time since my accident, I felt like I might actually be healing, like the life we were building together might eventually feel real and authentic. It was then, as Marcus raised his glass to toast our anniversary, that something shifted in my perception. The candlelight flickering across his face, the way he smiled as he spoke about our future together, the practiced smoothness of his romantic gestures, all of it suddenly felt choreographed and hollow. And in that moment of clarity, like a photograph developing in slow motion, I began to remember why I had left him. The memory hit me like a physical blow, so vivid and complete that I dropped my champagne glass, watching it shatter against the stone terrace. Marcus immediately rushed to my side, concerned about the broken glass, asking if I was hurt, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. I was remembering our real anniversary dinner, the one that had happened 4 years ago, before everything fell apart. We had been at Romano's, the little family restaurant near our old apartment, celebrating 2 years together. I had been wearing the blue dress he loved, the one with tiny flowers that brought out my eyes. Marcus had seemed nervous all evening, fidgeting with his napkin, checking his phone constantly, and when I'd asked what was wrong, he'd brushed off my concerns with that same practiced smile I was seeing now. But that night, 4 years ago, I hadn't been fooled by his deflection. I remembered excusing myself to use the restroom and seeing Marcus's phone light up on the table with a text message. The preview showed just enough to make my stomach drop. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow night. Delete this message." The sender was listed as A. Rodriguez, but I knew it wasn't his business associate, Antonio. This message had an intimacy to it, a secrecy that spoke of something Marcus was hiding from me. When I returned to the table, I had asked him directly about the message. Marcus had laughed it off, saying it was probably a work thing, that his assistant sometimes sent reminders that seemed personal because of her casual communication style. But his eyes had darted away from mine when he spoke, and his hand had instinctively moved to cover his phone. In that moment, I realized I'd been willfully blind to signs that had been accumulating for months, the late nights at work that had become more frequent. The new cologne he'd started wearing, the way he'd become protective of his phone, taking it with him to the bathroom, keeping it face down during conversations, the sudden interest in going to the gym, the new clothes, the attention to grooming that went beyond his usual careful appearance. I had noticed all of these changes but had chosen to interpret them charitably, as signs of professional ambition or personal growth rather than what they actually were. That anniversary dinner had been the beginning of the end, though it took me several more weeks to gather the courage to investigate my suspicions. The woman's name was Amanda Rodriguez, and she worked in the marketing department of Marcus's firm. She was 24 years old, recently graduated from college, with dark hair and an infectious laugh that I discovered when I finally looked her up on social media. She was beautiful in an effortless way that made me feel suddenly old and ordinary at 28. The evidence had been easier to find than I'd expected, perhaps because Marcus had grown careless in his confidence. Credit card statements showed dinners at restaurants we'd never been to together, charges at a hotel downtown during a week when he'd claimed to be traveling for business, but had actually been in the city the entire time. His laptop, which he usually guarded carefully, had been left open one evening with an email thread that revealed months of intimate correspondence. The emails were devastating, not just because they confirmed the affair, but because of how they portrayed our relationship. Marcus had described me as quote, suffocating and emotionally needy. He'd complained about my photography hobby, calling it a waste of money and time. He'd made fun of my close relationship with my family, describing my weekly calls to my parents as evidence that I was too dependent on others for validation. Reading those messages, I felt like I was seeing myself through the eyes of someone who found me fundamentally irritating and disappointing. But it wasn't just the affair that had driven me away. It was the gradual erosion of my sense of self that had been happening throughout our relationship, so slowly and subtly, that I hadn't recognized it until I saw it reflected in Marcus's cruel assessments. He had been systematically undermining my confidence, my independence, my relationships with others, all while maintaining the facade of a loving, supportive partner. I remembered now how he had discouraged me from taking the promotion at work, arguing that the increased responsibility would stress me out and affect our relationship. How he had found subtle ways to criticize my friends, pointing out their flaws and suggesting that I was too good for them, until I gradually stopped making plans with them. How he had convinced me that my family was too involved in our relationship, that healthy couples needed boundaries from their parents and siblings. The photography had been a particular point of contention. Marcus had never directly forbidden me from pursuing it, but he had made his disapproval clear through constant small criticisms. My equipment took up too much space in our apartment. The time I spent editing photos was time taken away from our relationship. The money I invested in lenses and workshops could be better spent on things for our home. Gradually, I had found myself making excuses for why I couldn't take that weekend photography trip, why I couldn't afford that new camera, why I didn't have time to enter that local competition. Sitting on that resort terrace, watching Marcus clean up the broken champagne glass with the same methodical care he brought to everything, I realized that my memory loss hadn't been the tragedy I'd believed it to be. It had been a gift, a chance to see our relationship without the accumulated weight of his manipulation and control. Without my memories of how he had gradually diminished me, I had been able to notice the inconsistencies, the subtle wrongness of the life he claimed we'd built together. The woman I had been 3 years ago had found the strength to leave him, despite his tears and promises and threats. She had packed her belongings while he was at work, leaving behind only a letter explaining that she knew about Amanda Rodriguez and that she couldn't continue living with someone who had such obvious contempt for her. She had moved in with her sister Jessica temporarily, ignoring Marcus's phone calls and text messages, blocking him on social media, and starting the difficult process of rebuilding her life. But now, with my memories returning in fragments, I was beginning to understand that leaving Marcus had been only the beginning of my journey toward independence. I remembered the first apartment I'd rented on my own, a tiny studio with barely enough room for my bed and desk, but with huge windows that filled the space with light. I remembered the relief of not having to justify how I spent my time, not having to defend my choices to someone who seemed to find fault with everything I did. I remembered reconnecting with friends I had lost touch with during my relationship with Marcus, people who welcomed me back without judgment and helped me remember who I had been before I had started seeing myself through his critical eyes. I remembered my parents' visit, how they had been so careful not to say, "I told you so," even though they had clearly had reservations about Marcus from the beginning. Most importantly, I remembered falling in love with photography again. Without Marcus's constant subtle discouragement, I had thrown myself back into the art that had once brought me so much joy. I had taken weekend trips to the coast, spending hours capturing the interplay of light and water. I had enrolled in advanced workshops, pushing myself to develop new techniques and perspectives. I had even started selling some of my work, first to friends and then to a local gallery that specialized in landscape photography. The life I had built after leaving Marcus had been challenging but fulfilling in ways our relationship had never been. I had been learning to trust my own judgment again, to value my own opinions, to pursue my passions without needing anyone else's approval. I had been dating occasionally but carefully, having learned to recognize the warning signs of controlling behavior that I had missed with Marcus. And then there had been David. I could see his face clearly now, though it brought a sharp pain to remember him. David Morrison, a park ranger I had met during a photography expedition to the National Forest about 2 hours north of the city. He had been leading a nature walk when I'd approached him for permission to photograph in a restricted area, and we'd ended up talking for nearly an hour about the local ecosystem and the best spots for landscape photography. David was everything Marcus wasn't. Quiet where Marcus was charming, outdoorsy where Marcus preferred indoor comforts, content where Marcus was always striving for more status and recognition. He loved that I was passionate about photography, often suggesting new locations for me to explore, and helping me carry equipment on difficult hikes. He encouraged my independence rather than trying to limit it, understanding that I needed time and space to pursue my own interests. Our relationship had developed slowly, built on genuine friendship and shared interests rather than the intense romantic chemistry that had initially drawn me to Marcus. David made me laugh without trying to impress me. He listened to my thoughts and opinions without immediately offering corrections or improvements. He seemed to genuinely like me as I was, rather than seeing me as a project to be improved or managed. I remembered our first kiss, which had happened during a camping trip to photograph the autumn foliage. We had been sitting by the campfire, discussing the day's shots, when he had simply leaned over and kissed me gently. There had been nothing calculated or performative about it, just a natural expression of affection that had felt right in a way that Marcus's more elaborate romantic gestures never had. With David, I had finally understood what a healthy relationship could feel like. We had our own interests and friendships, while also sharing experiences that we both enjoyed. He supported my career ambitions without trying to direct them, celebrated my successes without needing to claim credit for them, and accepted my occasional moods and insecurities without making me feel guilty for being human. But David was also the reason I had been driving alone on that rainy October night 3 years ago. We had plans to meet for dinner at a restaurant downtown, our 6-month anniversary of officially becoming a couple. I had been running late, hurrying through the rain to meet him, when the delivery truck had run the red light and changed everything. The cruelest irony was that Marcus had never been my emergency contact when the accident happened. That designation had belonged to my sister Jessica, who lived 3 states away. But somehow Marcus had gotten word of my condition, had shown up at the hospital claiming to be my husband, and in the chaos of trauma treatment and my obvious brain injury, no one had questioned his right to make decisions about my care. Jessica later told me during one of the conversations I was now remembering that she had tried to visit me in the hospital, but had been told that only immediate family was allowed, and that my husband had requested privacy during my recovery. She had been confused by this, since she knew I wasn't married, but the hospital staff had shown her documentation proving Marcus's claim. She had assumed that we had gotten married recently, and that I simply hadn't had a chance to update my emergency contacts. My parents had been similarly deceived, told by hospital administrators that their daughter was recovering well under her husband's care, and that too many visitors might interfere with her healing process. They had sent flowers and cards, which Marcus had claimed to give me but which I now realized I had never seen. They had called the hospital repeatedly, only to be told that I was sleeping, or in therapy, or too tired for phone conversations. The systematic isolation hadn't been accidental. Marcus had carefully orchestrated it, using my memory loss as an opportunity to rewrite our history and trap me in a relationship I had already escaped once. He had created false documents to support his claim that we were married, probably forged signatures on marriage certificates and other legal papers. He had researched my condition enough to understand how amnesia worked, how to manipulate my confusion and vulnerability to serve his purposes. Dr. Valdez, I now remembered, had never actually been my doctor. The real Dr. Valdez had been handling my case until Marcus had somehow arranged for my care to be transferred to a different neurologist, Dr. Patricia Williams, who had been more willing to support Marcus's version of events. The monthly appointments I remembered hadn't been follow-ups on my brain injury, but rather sessions with a therapist Marcus had hired to help reinforce the false memories he was trying to create. The apartment we'd been living in wasn't ours either. Marcus had rented it specifically for my recovery, creating a space that had no real history for either of us, but which he could claim represented our life together. The photo albums he had shown me weren't documentation of our relationship, but carefully constructed fiction, digital manipulation that placed my face in situations I had never experienced. Even my physical therapy had been part of the deception. While I had genuinely needed rehabilitation after the accident, Marcus had chosen therapists who were willing to cooperate with his version of events, people who believed they were helping a loving husband care for his injured wife. Maria Santos, the therapist I had grown fond of, had probably been told that my confusion about my life was a result of my brain injury rather than evidence that I was being systematically deceived. The medication that Dr. Valdez had supposedly recommended but that I had never received was probably something that would have helped restore my memories. Marcus had been intercepting prescriptions, managing my care in ways that would keep me confused and dependent on him for information about my own life. He had been gradually poisoning my recovery, ensuring that I remained vulnerable to his manipulation. But Marcus had made one crucial mistake in his elaborate deception. He had underestimated my fundamental personality, the core aspects of who I was that even brain injury couldn't completely erase. The woman who had found the strength to leave him once was still there, beneath the confusion and false memories, and she had been fighting to surface throughout my recovery. The strange emotional flashbacks I had experienced weren't random symptoms of brain trauma, but glimpses of suppressed memories trying to break through. The feelings of wrongness about our apartment, about the life Marcus claimed we shared, weren't confusion but intuition. My instinctive rejection of his explanations and stories wasn't paranoia, but wisdom, the hard-earned knowledge of someone who had already learned not to trust him. Sitting there on the resort terrace with Marcus kneeling beside me asking if I was hurt, expressing concern about the broken glass, I realized that this whole romantic weekend had been planned as the culmination of his manipulation. He had brought me here to propose again, to make our fake marriage real, to trap me legally in the relationship I had fought so hard to escape. The pearl necklace he had given me wasn't reminiscent of wedding jewelry I had worn because there had never been a wedding. It was his attempt to create a new memory, a romantic moment he could point to later as evidence of our love and commitment. The private dinner, the champagne, the string quartet, all of it had been calculated to overwhelm my defenses and make me susceptible to his next level of deception. But instead of falling for his romantic manipulation, I was remembering everything. The real anniversary dinner 4 years ago when I had first discovered his affair. The months of investigating and gathering evidence. The day I had finally found the courage to pack my bags and leave. The apartment I had rented, the friends I had reconnected with, the photography career I had been building. And David, sweet David who had loved me without trying to control me, who had been waiting for me at a restaurant when my life had been derailed by a delivery truck, and a man who couldn't accept that I had chosen to live without him. The memories were coming faster now, like a dam breaking and releasing years of suppressed experiences. I remembered Marcus's reaction when I had first left him, how he had alternated between rage and desperate pleas for reconciliation. I remembered the flowers that had appeared at my workplace, the letters that had been slipped under my apartment door, the phone calls from numbers I didn't recognize that turned out to be Marcus trying different approaches to reach me. I remembered having to change my phone number, having to ask friends not to share information about my whereabouts, having to vary my routines because Marcus had started showing up at places he knew I frequented. I remembered the relief I had felt when he had finally seemed to accept that our relationship was over, when the harassment had stopped and I had been able to move forward with my life. But Marcus had never really accepted it. He had just been waiting for an opportunity to force his way back into my life, and my accident had provided the perfect chance. While I had been unconscious and vulnerable, he had stolen my independence, my relationships, my very identity, creating a prison of false memories and manufactured dependence. The rage that filled me as I sat on that terrace was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just anger at being deceived, though that was part of it. It was fury at having my agency stolen, at being treated like a possession rather than a person, at having months of my life wasted in service of Marcus's delusion that he could make me love him again through manipulation and lies. But beneath the rage was something even stronger: determination. I had escaped Marcus once through my own strength and courage, and I could do it again. This time, however, I wouldn't be starting from scratch. This time, I knew exactly who he was and what he was capable of. This time, I would be prepared for his attempts to manipulate and control me. Marcus was still kneeling beside my chair, holding pieces of broken champagne glass, when I finally looked directly at him. His expression was concerned and loving, the perfect picture of a devoted husband worried about his wife's well-being. But now I could see the calculation behind his eyes, the careful monitoring of my reactions, the way he was already preparing his response to whatever I might say about my moment of distress. I needed to be careful. If Marcus realized that my memories were returning, he might become desperate enough to do something truly dangerous. I was in a remote location, hours from the city, dependent on him for transportation, surrounded by strangers who believed I was his wife. If I confronted him directly, he might decide that keeping me isolated permanently was preferable to losing control of the situation again. Instead, I forced myself to smile and apologize for my clumsiness, claiming that I had felt dizzy for a moment but that I was fine now. Marcus's relief seemed genuine, though I could see him filing away the incident for later analysis. He helped me to my feet and suggested that we go back to our room, that perhaps the altitude and champagne had been more affecting than we'd realized. As we walked back through the resort, Marcus's hand gentle on my arm, I began planning my escape. I needed to contact Jessica and my parents, needed to find out what had happened to David, needed to understand the full extent of Marcus's deception. But most importantly, I needed to do it all without alerting him to my recovered memories until I was safely away from him and had legal protection. The woman I had been before the accident had been strong enough to leave Marcus once. The woman I was now, armed with knowledge of his true nature and the full scope of his manipulation, would be strong enough to not just leave him but to make sure he could never hurt me or anyone else again. But first, I had to survive the rest of this weekend without revealing that his carefully constructed fantasy was crumbling around him. As Marcus helped me into bed that night, stroking my hair and murmuring reassurances about my health, I lay still and quiet, letting him believe that his devoted, dependent wife was simply tired from the evening's excitement. Inside, however, I was planning, remembering, and preparing for the battle I knew was coming. Marcus had stolen months of my life, but he wouldn't steal another day. The memories continued to flood back throughout that long, sleepless night, each one adding another piece to the puzzle of who I really was and what had been taken from me. By morning, I would be ready to reclaim my life, but this time I would be armed with the knowledge of exactly what Marcus was capable of and how far he was willing to go to possess what he believed belonged to him. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with sunlight streaming through the resort windows and painting everything in deceptively cheerful golden hues. Marcus was already awake when I opened my eyes, sitting in the chair by the window with his laptop open, typing quietly. He looked up when he noticed I was stirring, his face immediately brightening with that practiced smile I now recognized as a mask. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, closing the laptop and moving to sit on the edge of the bed. "How are you feeling? You gave me quite a scare last night with that dizzy spell." I stretched and yawned, buying myself time to think before responding. Every word I spoke needed to be carefully calculated now, every expression monitored to avoid arousing his suspicion. "I feel much better," I said, sitting up slowly as if still recovering from the previous evening's incident. "I think you were right about the altitude and champagne. I'm not used to drinking much since the accident." Marcus's face showed relief, but I caught the quick flicker of something else in his eyes. Satisfaction, perhaps. that I was attributing my distress to physical causes, rather than questioning the life he had constructed around me. "I'm so glad," he said, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from my face. "I was worried that we might need to cut our trip short and get you back to Dr. Williams for a checkup." The mention of Dr. Williams sent a chill through me. Now that my memories were returning, I recalled that the real neurologist who had treated me immediately after the accident had been Dr. Richard Chen, a specialist in traumatic brain injury who had been optimistic about my recovery prospects. Dr. Williams, the woman I had been seeing during my supposed recovery, was someone Marcus had found and paid to support his elaborate deception. "I don't think that's necessary," I said carefully. "I feel fine this morning. Maybe we should just take it easy today. Enjoy the resort without too much activity." Marcus seemed pleased by this suggestion, probably interpreting my desire for a quiet day as evidence that I was still fragile and dependent on his care. "That sounds perfect," he said. "I thought we could have breakfast on our balcony, maybe take a gentle walk around the grounds later. Nothing too strenuous." As Marcus ordered room service and busied himself with preparations for a leisurely morning, I excused myself to take a shower, grateful for a few minutes alone to process the flood of memories that continued to surface. Standing under the hot water, I closed my eyes and let myself remember more of the life Marcus had stolen from me. I could see David's face clearly now, remember the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentle way he had of touching my hand when he was making a point during our conversations. He had been nothing like Marcus in his approach to relationships. Where Marcus needed to be the center of attention, David was content to listen. Where Marcus tried to shape me into his ideal partner, David had seemed to genuinely appreciate who I already was. The memory of our last phone conversation just hours before my accident came back with painful clarity. David had called to confirm our dinner plans, but also to share exciting news about a photography opportunity. The National Park Service was looking for freelance photographers to document wildlife corridors in the region, and David had recommended me for the project based on some landscape shots I had shown him from my recent trips. "They specifically want someone who understands the local ecosystem," he had said, his voice warm with pride. "I told them about your work capturing the seasonal changes along the Ridge Trail, and they were really impressed. Sarah, this could be exactly the kind of break you've been hoping for." I had been thrilled by the opportunity, not just for the potential income, but for the validation that my photography was developing into something truly professional. After years of Marcus criticizing my artistic pursuits as impractical and self-indulgent, having someone recognize real talent in my work had felt like vindication of all the effort I had put into rebuilding my creative life. David and I had made plans to celebrate the news over dinner, and I had been rushing to meet him when the accident happened. I remembered now the specific intersection where the delivery truck had hit me, just 6 blocks from the restaurant where David had been waiting. He had probably sat there for hours, worrying about why I hadn't shown up, calling my phone and getting no answer because it had been destroyed in the crash. The cruelest part of Marcus's deception was imagining what David must have thought when I simply disappeared from his life. He wouldn't have known about the accident, wouldn't have had any way to find out what had happened to me. From his perspective, I had simply vanished without explanation, abandoning our relationship and the future we had been building together. By now, David probably assumed I had lost interest in him, that I had decided our relationship wasn't worth pursuing. The photography opportunity with the Park Service had probably gone to someone else when I failed to follow up. My absence from his life would have been just another mysterious disappointment. Another woman who had seemed genuine but had ultimately proven unreliable. The rage I felt at Marcus for stealing not just my life but also my chance at happiness with David was almost overwhelming. But I forced myself to stay calm, to focus on the practical steps I needed to take to escape the situation and reclaim my identity. Rage would only cloud my judgment and potentially put me in more danger if Marcus sensed that his control was slipping. When I emerged from the bathroom, Marcus had arranged a beautiful breakfast spread on our balcony table. Fresh fruit, pastries, coffee, and orange juice were artfully displayed, along with a small vase of wildflowers he must have picked from the resort grounds. Under different circumstances, it would have been a romantic and thoughtful gesture. Now it felt like another manipulation, another attempt to create false memories that would bind me to him. "This looks wonderful," I said, settling into the chair he held out for me. "You always know how to make things special." The compliment seemed to please him enormously, and I could see him filing it away as evidence that his efforts to win me back were succeeding. We ate in comfortable silence for a while, with Marcus occasionally pointing out interesting birds or commenting on the mountain views. To any observer, we would have looked like a perfectly happy couple enjoying a romantic getaway. But I was using the quiet time to formulate a plan. I needed to contact my sister Jessica and find out what had really happened during my hospitalization and recovery. I needed to locate David and explain what had happened, assuming he was willing to listen after months of unexplained silence. Most importantly, I needed to gather evidence of Marcus's deception and fraud before confronting him or attempting to leave. The challenge was that Marcus controlled every aspect of my current life. He had my identification documents, managed our finances, and had isolated me from anyone who might help me verify my real history. I was completely dependent on him for transportation, communication, and even basic necessities. Escaping would require careful planning and probably outside assistance. During our walk around the resort grounds later that morning, I paid close attention to the layout and facilities, looking for opportunities to contact the outside world without Marcus's knowledge. The resort had a business center with computers and phones, but it was located near the main desk where Marcus would easily notice if I tried to use it. There was also a small gift shop that sold postcards and stamps, but sending mail would be too slow and uncertain. My best option seemed to be finding a way to use someone else's phone, but that would require confiding in a stranger about my situation, and Marcus had been so convincing in his role as devoted husband that most people would probably assume I was confused or delusional if I claimed he was holding me captive through fraud and deception. As we walked past the resort's spa, I noticed a sign advertising various treatments including massages and facials. An idea began to form in my mind. Spa treatments typically took place in private rooms, away from Marcus's supervision, and the staff might be more willing to help if I could convince them I was in danger. "That looks relaxing," I said, stopping to read the spa menu posted outside. "I think a massage might be good for me, help with the stress of yesterday evening." Marcus looked pleased by the suggestion. "What a great idea," he said. "I could book us couples treatments, make it part of our anniversary celebration." This wasn't what I had in mind, but I forced myself to smile. "Actually, I think I'd prefer some individual time to really focus on relaxation. Maybe you could enjoy the pool while I'm at the spa?" For a moment, Marcus's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, and I could see him weighing the risks of letting me out of his sight against the benefits of appearing supportive and understanding. The devoted husband persona won out, and he nodded agreeably. "Of course, whatever makes you feel best," he said. "I'll book you an appointment for this afternoon." While Marcus made arrangements at the front desk, I wandered over to examine a display of local hiking maps and brochures. One of the maps showed the resort's location relative to the nearest town, which was about 15 miles away through winding mountain roads. Without a car, I would be trapped here unless I could convince someone to help me leave, which seemed unlikely given that everyone believed Marcus was my husband. But seeing the map gave me another idea. If I could somehow get word to the authorities in town about my situation, they might be able to verify my real identity and expose Marcus's deception. Police departments had access to databases that would show my actual emergency contacts and medical history, information that would contradict everything Marcus had told people about our relationship. The challenge was making contact with law enforcement without alerting Marcus to what I was doing. Even if I managed to get to a phone, calling 911 from the resort would likely result in someone coming to check on me here, where Marcus could easily convince them that I was having some kind of psychological episode related to my brain injury. By early afternoon, Marcus had arranged for me to have a 90-minute massage at the resort spa, followed by a facial treatment. He seemed genuinely pleased to be able to provide me with something I had requested, which made his deception even more chilling. In his mind, he was probably being a loving, attentive husband, rather than a kidnapper maintaining control over his victim. The spa was located in a separate building connected to the main resort by covered walkways lined with flowering plants. The atmosphere was deliberately calming, with soft music, aromatherapy scents, and staff members who spoke in hushed, soothing tones. Under normal circumstances, I would have found it genuinely relaxing. My massage therapist was a woman about my age named Elena, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put me at ease. As she worked on the tension in my shoulders and back, we made quiet conversation about the resort, the mountain weather, and general topics that seemed safe and neutral. But I was studying her carefully, trying to assess whether she might be someone I could trust with the truth about my situation. About halfway through the massage, Elena commented that I seemed to be carrying a lot of stress in my neck and shoulders, that my muscles felt like those of someone who had been through significant trauma. "Have you been dealing with a lot of stress lately?" she asked gently. The question gave me an opening, and I decided to test the waters carefully. "I was in a car accident several months ago," I said. "I'm still recovering from some of the effects." Elena made sympathetic sounds and adjusted her technique to focus on areas where she could feel the most tension. "That must have been terrifying," she said. "Are you here at the resort as part of your recovery process?" "In a way," I replied, choosing my words carefully. "My husband thought a romantic getaway would be good for me, help me feel more like myself again." "That's wonderful that you have such a supportive partner," Elena said. "Recovery from trauma is so much easier when you have people who care about you." Her comment made my heart sink. Even Elena, who seemed genuinely caring and perceptive, had immediately assumed that Marcus was a loving husband, rather than questioning whether there might be more to the story. The role he was playing was so convincing, so carefully crafted, that people naturally accepted it without suspicion. But as the massage continued, I noticed that Elena was paying close attention to my responses, that she seemed to be picking up on subtle signs of distress that I couldn't completely hide. When she asked me to turn over onto my back, she studied my face for a moment before continuing her work. "Forgive me if this is too personal," she said quietly, "but you seem like someone who's been through more than just a car accident. There's something in your eyes that reminds me of clients I've worked with who were dealing with other kinds of trauma." The perceptiveness of her observation caught me off guard, and I felt tears starting to form before I could stop them. Elena immediately paused her work and handed me tissues, her expression full of concern. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to compose myself. "I don't know why I'm getting emotional." "Don't apologize," Elena said firmly. "Sometimes our bodies hold on to things our minds aren't ready to process yet. It's completely normal for physical therapy to bring up unexpected emotions." Her kindness and intuition made me want to trust her, but I was still afraid of the consequences if I revealed too much and Marcus found out. Instead, I tried a different approach. "Elena, can I ask you something? If someone was in trouble, if they needed help but couldn't ask for it directly, what would you advise them to do?" Elena's hands stilled on my shoulders, and I could see her processing the implications of my question. "That's a very specific hypothetical," she said carefully. "Is there something you need help with?" The moment of decision had arrived. I could continue pretending that everything was fine, complete my spa treatments, and return to Marcus to continue living the lie he had constructed. Or I could take the risk of trusting Elena with the truth, knowing that she might not believe me, or might inadvertently alert Marcus to my suspicions. "I think," I said slowly, "that I'm not who my husband says I am, and I think I might be in danger." Elena's expression became immediately serious, and she moved to position herself between me and the door of the treatment room. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly. Taking a deep breath, I began to tell her everything. About waking up in the hospital with no memory of the past several years. About the life Marcus claimed we had shared. About the inconsistencies I had noticed. And about the memories that had started returning the night before. I told her about David, about the real relationship I had been in when the accident happened, about my suspicion that Marcus had somehow manipulated my medical care to gain control over my recovery. Elena listened without interruption, her expression growing more concerned with each detail I shared. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, clearly trying to process the enormity of what I had told her. "Sarah," she said finally, "if what you're telling me is true, this is not just about being in danger. This is about someone who has committed serious crimes against you. Identity theft, fraud, possibly kidnapping. We need to contact the police immediately." The validation of having someone believe me was overwhelming, and I started crying again, this time from relief rather than fear. "I don't know how to prove any of it," I said. "He has all my identification, controls all our accounts. Everyone believes we're married because he has documents that seem to prove it." "Documents can be forged," Elena said grimly. "But there are ways to verify your real identity that he can't fake. Medical records, employment history, family contacts. The police have access to databases that will show who you really are." Elena moved to a cabinet in the corner of the room and pulled out her purse, extracting her cell phone. "I'm going to call the local sheriff's department," she said. "They deal with situations like this more often than you might think. Tourist areas sometimes attract people who prey on vulnerability." As Elena made the call, explaining the situation to what sounded like a dispatcher, I felt a mixture of hope and terror. Hope that I might finally be free of Marcus's deception, but terror about what he might do when he realized his control was slipping. I had already seen how far he was willing to go to possess me. There was no telling how he might react if he felt cornered. The dispatcher apparently took Elena's call seriously, because within minutes she was transferring the call to a detective who specialized in fraud and identity crimes. Elena handed me the phone so I could speak directly to the officer, a woman named Detective Lisa Moreau who had a calm, professional manner that immediately inspired confidence. "Ms. Chen," Detective Moreau said, using my real name after I had explained my situation, "what you're describing is a very serious crime, and I want you to know that we're going to take every step necessary to protect you and investigate your claims. Can you tell me where you are right now, and whether you feel immediately safe?" I explained about the resort, about Marcus waiting for me to finish my spa treatments, about my fear of what he might do if he suspected I had recovered my memories. Detective Moreau listened carefully, asking pointed questions about the timeline of events and the specific claims Marcus had made about our relationship. "I'm going to send officers to your location immediately," she said. "They'll be discreet, but they'll be there to ensure your safety while we sort this out. In the meantime, I need you to stay exactly where you are and not alert your companion to the fact that you've contacted us. Can you do that?" Elena had been listening to my side of the conversation, and when I hung up the phone, she immediately began making plans to help me stay safe until the police arrived. "We can extend your treatments," she said. "Add a facial, maybe a manicure. Anything to keep you in the spa building and away from him until help gets here." The next hour was the longest of my life. Elena stayed with me the entire time, occasionally stepping out to coordinate with the front desk staff and ensure that Marcus would be told I was still receiving treatments. She had apparently confided in her supervisor about the situation, because other spa employees began finding reasons to check on us, creating a protective barrier around me without making it obvious to any outside observers. Through the spa's windows, I could see Marcus lounging by the pool, occasionally glancing toward the spa building but showing no signs of concern or suspicion. He had brought a book and seemed genuinely relaxed, probably pleased that his anniversary surprise was going so well. The sight of him looking so content while I lived in terror of his discovery made my anger burn even hotter. When Detective Moreau and 2 other officers finally arrived at the resort, they were dressed in casual clothes that allowed them to blend in with the other guests. Elena met them at the spa entrance and brought them to where I was waiting, now fully dressed and trying to prepare myself for the confrontation I knew was coming. Detective Moreau was a woman in her 40s, with short, gray hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She shook my hand and immediately began explaining how they would handle the situation. "We've already run preliminary checks on your identity," she said, "and I can confirm that there is no record of a marriage between Sarah Chen and Marcus Thompson. Your real emergency contact is listed as Jessica Chen in Portland, Oregon, and your medical records show that you were treated by Dr. Richard Chen at Cedar Valley Medical, not Dr. Patricia Williams, as your companion claims." The relief of having my story validated by official sources was almost overwhelming. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we go talk to Mr. Thompson," Detective Moreau said. "We're going to approach this carefully, because we don't want him to panic or become violent. You'll stay with Officer Martinez while Detective Stone and I handle the initial contact." As we prepared to leave the spa, Elena squeezed my hand and wished me luck. "You're braver than you know," she said. "What you did today took incredible courage." Walking across the resort grounds toward the pool where Marcus was still reading, I felt like I was moving through a dream. After months of living in the false reality he had created, I was finally going to confront him with the truth. Part of me was terrified of his reaction, but a larger part of me was ready to reclaim my life and expose him for what he really was. Detective Moreau and Detective Stone approached Marcus casually, as if they were simply resort guests looking to chat. I watched from a distance as they introduced themselves and began what appeared to be a friendly conversation. But I could see the moment when Marcus realized something was wrong, when his relaxed posture shifted to alertness and his eyes began scanning the area around the pool. When his gaze found me standing with Officer Martinez, his face went through a series of rapid changes. Surprise, confusion, anger, and finally, a cold calculation that I recognized from my recovered memories of our real relationship. This was the Marcus I had learned to fear, the one who appeared when his control was challenged. He stood up abruptly, causing Detective Moreau to step back and place her hand near her weapon. I couldn't hear their conversation from where I stood, but I could see Marcus becoming increasingly agitated, gesturing toward me and apparently trying to convince the detectives that I was confused or mentally unstable. But the detectives had come prepared with evidence of his deception, and whatever they showed him caused his shoulders to slump in defeat. The game was over, and Marcus finally realized that his elaborate fantasy had collapsed. As Detective Stone placed handcuffs on his wrists and began reading him his rights, Marcus looked directly at me across the pool area. The expression on his face was one of pure hatred, not the love he had been performing for months. In that moment, I saw who he really was beneath all the romantic gestures and caring words. He was someone who viewed me as property rather than a person, someone who believed he had the right to shape my life according to his desires regardless of my own wishes. As the police led Marcus away, Detective Moreau approached me with paperwork and explanations of what would happen next. There would be investigations, court proceedings, and a long process of untangling the legal and financial mess Marcus had created. But for the first time in months, I felt like myself again, like the woman who had found the strength to leave him once and would now see him face justice for what he had done. The sun was setting behind the mountains as I finally walked back to the resort room that Marcus and I had shared, but this time I was accompanied by Officer Martinez and felt completely safe. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of reclaiming my real life, of reconnecting with the people Marcus had stolen from me, and of building a future based on truth, rather than manipulation and lies. 3 weeks later, I stood in the doorway of my real apartment, the one I had rented after leaving Marcus the first time. Jessica had kept it for me during my disappearance, paying the rent from my savings account and maintaining it exactly as I had left it. The key felt familiar in my hand as I turned the lock, and stepping inside was like coming home after a very long, very strange dream. Everything was exactly where I remembered it. My photography equipment was arranged on the desk by the window, my books were scattered around the living room in the organized chaos I preferred, and my grandmother's quilt was still folded over the back of the couch. Jessica had even kept my plants alive, the small succulents that lined the windowsill thriving under her careful attention. The contrast with the sterile apartment Marcus had created for his fantasy was overwhelming. This space felt lived in and personal, full of the small details that made it uniquely mine. The coffee mug with the chip on the handle that I refused to throw away. The framed photograph of my parents from their anniversary last year. The stack of photography magazines I had been reading before the accident. This was my real life, the one Marcus had tried to erase. Detective Moreau had been true to her word about unraveling Marcus's deception. The investigation had revealed the full scope of his crimes, which went far beyond what I had initially suspected. He had forged marriage certificates, created false medical records, and bribed or manipulated several people to support his elaborate scheme. The fake Dr. Williams turned out to be a former therapist who had lost her license for unethical conduct and had been willing to participate in Marcus's plan in exchange for money. Most shocking was the discovery that Marcus had been planning this deception for months before my accident even happened. Police found detailed files on his computer documenting my daily routines, my relationships, my work schedule, even my medical history. He had been stalking me systematically, gathering information that would allow him to step in and take control if the opportunity arose. The accident itself had been genuinely random, but Marcus had somehow learned about it within hours and had rushed to the hospital to present himself as my husband. The chaos of trauma treatment and my obvious brain injury had made it easy for him to establish himself as my next of kin before anyone thought to verify his claims. By the time I woke up, he had already made himself indispensable to my care team. The legal consequences for Marcus were severe. He was facing charges for fraud, identity theft, false imprisonment, and forgery, among others. His attorney had tried to argue that his actions were motivated by love rather than malicious intent, but the evidence of premeditation made that defense impossible to sustain. Detective Moreau told me that similar cases often resulted in sentences of 10 to 15 years, and Marcus would likely serve the majority of his time given the sophisticated nature of his crimes. But the most important revelation came when Detective Moreau told me about David. He had indeed been waiting for me at the restaurant that night, and when I didn't show up, he had spent hours trying to reach me. When my phone went straight to voicemail and I didn't respond to texts, he had assumed something serious had happened. He had even filed a missing person report the next day, but it had been closed when Marcus presented documentation showing that I was his wife and was receiving medical care. David had never stopped looking for answers about what had happened to me. He had contacted my workplace, tried to reach my family, and had even hired a private investigator to trace my whereabouts. The investigator had eventually discovered that I was living with someone claiming to be my husband, but without evidence of wrongdoing, there was nothing they could do legally. When Detective Moreau contacted David to inform him about Marcus's arrest and my recovery, he had driven straight from the mountains where he was working on a conservation project. I was terrified about seeing him again, uncertain whether our relationship could survive the months of unexplained absence and the trauma I had endured. But when he knocked on my apartment door 2 days after I had moved back in, his first words were simply, "I never stopped believing you were out there." The reunion was emotional and complicated. David was furious about what Marcus had done to me, but his anger was protective rather than accusatory. He blamed himself for not finding me sooner, for not pushing harder when the missing person case was closed. I had to reassure him repeatedly that none of what happened was his fault, that Marcus's deception had been too sophisticated for anyone to easily uncover. Physically, David looked older than I remembered, with lines around his eyes that spoke of months of worry and stress. But when he smiled, when he held my hand and told me about the work he had been doing in the national forest, I could see that the man I had fallen in love with was still there. The connection between us hadn't been broken by time or circumstance. It had simply been temporarily interrupted by someone else's malicious interference. Our relationship was different now, shaped by the knowledge of how easily it could be taken away. We talked for hours about what we had both experienced during the separation, about the fears and hopes we had carried, about the future we wanted to build together. David had never stopped loving me, but he was careful not to pressure me into picking up exactly where we had left off. He understood that I needed time to process the trauma and to rediscover who I was outside of Marcus's manipulation. The photography opportunity with the National Park Service was still available, David told me. The project had been delayed due to funding issues, and when it was finally approved, the hiring manager had specifically asked whether I might still be interested. My disappearance had actually enhanced my reputation in some ways, with people in the conservation community assuming I had been working on some mysterious long-term project that required secrecy. Returning to photography felt like reconnecting with a part of myself that Marcus had tried to destroy. My equipment was exactly as I had left it, and when I held my camera again for the first time in months, it felt like greeting an old friend. The muscle memory was still there, the instinctive understanding of light and composition that had taken years to develop. Marcus had stolen many things from me, but he hadn't been able to touch the core of my artistic vision. My first photo shoot after recovering my memories was at the beach where David and I had taken our first weekend trip together. Standing on the rocks with my camera, watching the interplay of light and water, I felt more like myself than I had since waking up in that hospital room. The photographs I captured that day weren't technically perfect, but they were infused with emotion and authenticity in a way that my earlier work had sometimes lacked. Jessica had been my rock throughout the entire ordeal, handling legal paperwork, coordinating with Detective Moreau, and providing emotional support when the weight of what had happened threatened to overwhelm me. She had never believed Marcus's story about our supposed estrangement, she told me. But she had been powerless to challenge it without concrete evidence of wrongdoing. The guilt she felt about not fighting harder to see me during my supposed recovery was something we both had to work through. My parents, when they finally learned the truth, were devastated by what they perceived as their failure to protect me. They had accepted Marcus's explanations about my condition and my need for limited contact because they trusted that medical professionals knew what was best for my recovery. Learning that their daughter had been held captive while they respected boundaries that didn't actually exist was almost unbearable for them. The family reunion was emotional but healing. Sitting around my parents' kitchen table, sharing stories and rebuilding connections that Marcus had tried to sever, I realized how much of my identity was tied to these relationships. I wasn't just Sarah the photographer or Sarah the girlfriend. I was Sarah the daughter, the sister, the friend. Marcus had tried to isolate me from these roles, to make me dependent entirely on him for my sense of self, but the connections had proven stronger than his manipulation. Dr. Richard Chen, my real neurologist, was fascinated by my case from a medical perspective. He confirmed that my memory recovery was remarkable, but not unprecedented, and that the emotional trauma I had experienced might actually have contributed to the suppression of my memories initially. The brain, he explained, sometimes protects itself from overwhelming experiences by creating barriers around traumatic events. The therapy I began after Marcus's arrest focused on processing not just the recent trauma, but also the original relationship that had made me vulnerable to his manipulation in the first place. I learned to recognize the patterns of control and emotional abuse that had characterized our time together, the subtle ways he had undermined my confidence and independence, even before the accident gave him the opportunity for more dramatic deception. Working with Dr. Sarah Martinez, a therapist who specialized in recovery from psychological abuse, I began to understand how Marcus had systematically eroded my sense of self during our original relationship. The criticism of my photography, the isolation from friends and family, the constant suggestions that I was too sensitive or too dependent on others, had all been designed to make me doubt my own judgment and become more reliant on his approval. The criminal trial was scheduled for 6 months after Marcus's arrest, giving prosecutors time to build their case and giving me time to prepare for the emotional challenge of testifying against him. Detective Moreau warned me that Marcus's defense team would likely try to portray him as a devoted boyfriend who had simply been confused about the nature of our relationship, but the evidence of premeditation made such a defense difficult to sustain. When the trial finally began, I was nervous, but determined to see justice done. Taking the stand to describe what Marcus had done to me was one of the hardest things I had ever experienced, but also one of the most empowering. For months, I had lived in the reality he had created for me, accepting his version of events, because I had no alternative framework for understanding my life. Now I was finally able to tell my own story, to reclaim my narrative from someone who had stolen it. Marcus's reaction to my testimony was revealing. He stared at me with the same cold hatred I had seen at the resort when his deception was exposed, making no attempt to maintain the loving husband persona that had fooled so many people. The jury could see exactly who he really was beneath the mask of charm and concern he had worn for so long. The verdict was guilty on all counts, and Marcus was sentenced to 12 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 8. It wasn't long enough to fully account for what he had stolen from me, but it was sufficient to ensure that he couldn't hurt me or anyone else for a significant period of time. More importantly, it was an official acknowledgement that what he had done was criminal, not romantic, and that I had been a victim rather than a willing participant in his fantasy. 6 months after the trial ended, David and I took a camping trip to the same national forest where we had first met. It was spring, and the landscape was alive with new growth and the promise of longer, warmer days ahead. We spent the weekend hiking familiar trails and discovering new ones, with me documenting the changing seasons and David sharing his knowledge of the local ecosystem. On our last evening, as we sat by the campfire sharing stories and planning future adventures, David asked me to marry him. The proposal was simple and genuine. Nothing like the elaborate romantic gestures Marcus had used to manipulate my emotions. David simply said that he loved me, that he wanted to build a life together based on honesty and mutual respect, and that he would be honored if I would be his wife. I said yes without hesitation, knowing that this time I was making the choice freely, with full knowledge of who I was and what I wanted from life. The ring David offered me was a simple band with a small stone that reflected the firelight, beautiful in its understated elegance. It was nothing like the flashy jewelry Marcus had used to try to bind me to him. It was a symbol of a partnership between equals rather than a chain disguised as a gift. Our wedding, when it happened 6 months later, was everything Marcus had claimed our fictional ceremony had been. Small and intimate, held in my parents' backyard with only family and close friends in attendance. I wore a dress I had chosen myself, carried flowers from my mother's garden, and spoke vows that came from my own heart rather than someone else's script. The photographs from that day, taken by Jessica with my guidance, captured genuine joy and love, rather than the performed happiness I had seen in the fake wedding albums Marcus had created. Now, 2 years later, I run a successful freelance photography business specializing in conservation and wildlife documentation. The National Park Service project led to other opportunities, and my work has been featured in several magazines and exhibitions. More importantly, I wake up every morning in a life I have chosen for myself, surrounded by people who love and respect me for who I am rather than who they want me to be. The experience with Marcus taught me that our memories are more fragile than we realize, but also that our core identity is more resilient than we imagine. He was able to steal months of my life and create a false reality around me, but he couldn't fundamentally change who I was. The woman who had found the strength to leave him once was still there, waiting for the chance to emerge again. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if my memories hadn't returned that night at the resort, if Marcus's deception had continued indefinitely. But I've learned not to dwell on such thoughts. Instead, I focus on the life I'm building now, the real relationships and genuine achievements that no one can take away from me. I've learned to trust my instincts, to value my independence, and to never again allow someone else to define my reality for me. The amnesia that had seemed like such a devastating loss turned out to be the key to my freedom. By forgetting Marcus's manipulation, I was able to see our relationship clearly for the first time and recognize the inconsistencies that revealed his deception. In losing my memories, I ultimately found myself again, stronger and wiser than before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.